Margaret Whitmore thought she was simply cleaning her son's childhood bedroom, but what she discovered hidden in a locked wooden box would shatter everything she believed about her perfect family. For 8 months, Evan had been writing passionate love letters to a woman his parents had never met, a woman whose very existence would challenge everything the prestigious Whitmore family stood for. As Margaret read words of devotion that revealed her son's secret life, she had no idea that this discovery would force them all to choose between the comfort of their privileged world and a love that could either unite them or destroy them forever. What started as a mother's innocent curiosity was about to become a test of whether blood truly runs thicker than the barriers we build around our hearts. The letters were just the beginning, but the choice that would tear this family apart was yet to come. If you're ready to discover whether love can truly conquer all, hit subscribe and tell me what city you're watching from. The late afternoon sun streamed through the lace curtains of Evan's childhood bedroom, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Margaret Whitmore moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been organizing homes for 40 years. Dust particles danced in the golden light as she folded his old sweaters and sorted through books he'd left behind when he moved to his own place across town. She had been putting off this task for months. Evan was 29 now, successful in his own quiet way, managing the family's investments with the same careful attention their grandfather had taught him. But this room still held traces of the boy who used to read under these same windows, who collected rocks from the beach and lined them up on the windowsill like tiny soldiers. Margaret reached for a stack of college textbooks on the closet shelf. As she lifted them, something shifted behind the books. A wooden box, small and dark, slid forward. She caught it before it could fall. The box was beautiful in its simplicity. Rich walnut wood, smooth from handling, with brass hinges that had aged to a soft green. It felt substantial in her hands, not heavy but full. She turned it over, looking for some indication of what it might contain. There was no label, no marking except for tiny scratches near the lock. Someone had opened this box many times. Margaret set it on the bed and continued her work, but her eyes kept drifting back to it. In 40 years of marriage to Charles, she had learned to respect privacy. But she had also learned that sometimes the things people kept hidden were the things that mattered most. The house was quiet. Charles was at his study downtown, reviewing contracts. Evan wouldn't be by until dinner. She sat on the edge of the bed and picked up the box again. The lock was small, the kind that might keep out casual curiosity, but nothing more. She tried the latch. To her surprise, it opened with a gentle click. Inside, nestled in what looked like a bed of soft fabric, were dozens of letters. Handwritten letters, each one folded carefully and tied with a thin ribbon. The paper was cream-colored, expensive. The ink was dark blue, written in Evan's careful script. Margaret lifted the first letter. The address was written in his formal hand. For Lena, with all my love. Her heart stopped. Lena. Not Elizabeth or Catherine or any of the names from the social circle she knew. Not Sarah Pemberton, who had asked about Evan just last month at the charity luncheon. Not any of the young women Margaret had pictured as potential daughters-in-law. Lena. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the letter. She told herself she should stop, should close the box and pretend she had never found it. But the mother in her, the part that had worried about Evan's quiet nature and wondered why he seemed content to spend his evenings alone, needed to understand. The letter was dated 3 months ago. My dearest Lena, I walked past your bookstore this morning on my way to the bank, and I saw you arranging the display in the front window. You were wearing that blue dress, the one that makes your eyes look like they're holding secrets. You were so focused on getting the books just right, tilting your head the way you do when you're thinking. I wanted to stop and help you reach the high shelf, but I know you're proud of doing things yourself. I love that about you. I love how you never ask for help unless you really need it, and how you always notice when other people do. I've been thinking about what you said last week, about wanting to travel to see the places all these books come from. I want to take you there, Lena. I want to show you Paris in the spring and the bookshops along the Seine. I want to watch you discover new stories in old places. Someday soon, I'm going to find the courage to tell the world how lucky I am to love you. Forever yours, Evan. Margaret's chest felt tight. The words were so tender, so full of longing and affection, that she felt like an intruder just reading them. But she couldn't stop. She opened another letter, this one dated 6 months ago. Lena. You fell asleep on my shoulder during the movie tonight. I stayed perfectly still for 2 hours because I didn't want to wake you. You smelled like the vanilla candles you keep in your apartment and that shampoo you use that reminds me of summer rain. When you sleep, your face relaxes in this way that makes you look younger somehow. Not that you're old, you're not even 30, but when you're awake, you carry so much awareness in your expression. You're always watching, always thinking, always caring about the people around you. I want to be the person you can stop watching with. I want to be the place where you feel safe enough to just rest. Your devoted Evan. Margaret's mind raced. These weren't casual notes. These were love letters in the truest sense, written by someone who paid attention to details, who noticed the small things that made another person beautiful. They were letters from a man deeply in love. Why had she never met this woman? Why had Evan never mentioned her name? She opened a third letter, then a fourth. Each one revealed more of a relationship that had clearly been going on for months, maybe longer. References to shared meals, to conversations about books, to quiet evenings spent together. References to Lena's grandmother, to her work at a bookstore, to her dreams of traveling. And in every letter, a thread of something that made Margaret's heart sink. Evan wrote like a man who was hiding. I know you want me to bring you to family dinner, one letter read. I know you wonder why I haven't. It's not because I'm ashamed of you. How could anyone be ashamed of you? You're the most genuine person I've ever known. It's because I'm ashamed of myself for being too weak to handle their questions, their assumptions, their way of making everything about status and appearances. You deserve someone braver than me. But I'm trying to become that person, Lena. I'm trying to find the courage you've always had. Margaret closed the letter and sat in the gathering dusk. Outside, she could hear the sound of waves against the shore, the same sound that had lulled Evan to sleep as a child. She had always been proud of her family's place in this coastal town, their old house with its history and their name that opened doors. But as she sat holding these letters, she wondered what doors that name might have closed. She looked at the box again. There were more letters, dozens of them, evidence of a love affair that had been happening right under her nose, in her own town, involving her own son. A love affair he had kept completely secret. The sound of Charles's car in the driveway broke her from her thoughts. She quickly gathered the letters, retying them with their ribbons and placing them back in the box, but she didn't put the box back on the closet shelf. Instead, she carried it downstairs with her. Dinner at the Whitmore house was served at 7 o'clock every evening that Charles was in town. It was a tradition that went back to the early years of their marriage, when Margaret had decided that no matter how busy their lives became, they would always have this time together. The dining room table was long enough to seat 12, though it was usually just the three of them when Evan joined them. Tonight, Margaret had set 3 places at one end, the way she always did when it was family only. Charles poured the wine while Margaret brought out the roast. Evan arrived exactly on time, as he always did, kissing his mother's cheek and shaking his father's hand before taking his usual seat. "How was your day?" Margaret asked, the same question she had asked him since he was 15, and started caring about having real answers. "Good," Evan said, unfolding his napkin. "Quiet day at the office. The Hendersons' portfolio is doing well, and I think the Millers are finally ready to make some changes to their investment strategy." Charles nodded approvingly. Evan had always had a gift for understanding people's comfort levels with money. He never pushed, never made anyone feel foolish for being conservative or ambitious. It was one of the things that made him so good at what he did. "Mrs. Pemberton asked about you again," Margaret said, serving the vegetables. "Her daughter Sarah is back from graduate school. She's working at the museum now." Evan made a polite noise and reached for his water glass. This was another family tradition, Margaret's gentle efforts to introduce Evan to suitable young women. He had always deflected these attempts with good humor, and Margaret had assumed it was because he was focused on work or simply hadn't met the right person yet. Now she knew better. The wooden box sat on the sideboard behind Charles's chair, where she had placed it before dinner. Evan hadn't noticed it yet, but Margaret's eyes kept drifting to it. "Evan," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, I was cleaning out your old room today. He looked up from his plate. Thank you. I know I should have done that months ago. I found something interesting. She stood and retrieved the box, setting it on the table between the wineglasses and the serving dishes. Evan's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. The color drained from his face so quickly that Margaret thought he might be sick. I think this belongs to you, she said gently. Charles looked from the box to Evan to Margaret, his eyebrows drawing together in confusion. What is it? Margaret opened the box. The letters lay inside, neat and ribbon-bound, exactly as she had found them. Evan set down his fork. His hands were shaking. Son? Charles's voice carried the authority that had served him well in business, but also genuine concern. Margaret lifted one of the letters. Who is Lena? The question hung in the air like smoke from a candle that had just been blown out. Evan stared at the letters as if they were evidence of a crime he had hoped would never be discovered. Evan, Charles said, his voice firmer now. Your mother asked you a question. Evan finally looked up, meeting his mother's eyes. In his face, she saw the same expression he had worn as a child when he broke something valuable. Not defiance, but acceptance that the truth would come out eventually. Did you read them? He asked quietly. I read enough, Margaret said. Charles reached for one of the letters, but Evan's hand shot out, covering the box protectively. Please don't. Then explain, Charles said. Who is Lena, and why are you writing her love letters? The word love seemed to echo in the quiet dining room. Margaret watched her son's face as he processed the fact that his father had said it out loud, that the secret he had kept so carefully was now sitting on the dinner table like a centerpiece. Evan took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. Her name is Lena Brooks. She works at the bookstore on Harbor Street, and yes, they're love letters, because I love her. The simplicity of his statement was somehow more powerful than any elaborate explanation could have been. He spoke like someone who was relieved to finally tell the truth, even if the truth was going to change everything. Charles sat back in his chair. How long? 8 months. 8 months? Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. Evan, why didn't you tell us? But even as she asked the question, she thought she knew the answer. The way Charles was sitting, rigid and formal. The way her own mind had immediately jumped to questions about this woman's background, her family, her place in their social circle. The way they were having this conversation at all, instead of simply being happy that their son had found someone who made him write poetry about vanilla candles and summer rain. Evan looked from his mother to his father, and Margaret could see him making calculations, trying to find words that would explain 8 months of secrecy without hurting anyone's feelings. Because I knew it would be complicated, he said finally. Complicated how? Charles asked. Evan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very softly, because she's black, and I didn't know how to tell you that without making it sound like I thought it should matter. The silence that followed was so complete that Margaret could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, marking seconds that felt like hours. Charles set down his wineglass with the careful precision of someone trying not to make any sudden movements. Margaret's mind raced through 1,000 thoughts at once, images of charity events and country club dinners, of conversations about appropriate families and our kind of people, the quiet, unspoken assumptions that had shaped her life, and she realized now, her expectations for her son's life. It doesn't matter, she said quickly, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. It shouldn't matter, but in their world, their carefully ordered world of old families and older money, it would matter to people who mattered to them. Evan looked at her with something that might have been pity. Doesn't it? The question was gentle, but it cut through years of polite pretending in a way that made Margaret's chest hurt. Charles cleared his throat. What does she do, besides the bookstore? She manages the bookstore. She's working on her master's degree in literature. She takes care of her grandmother. Evan's voice grew stronger with each detail, as if he was grateful to finally be able to talk about Lena as a real person instead of a secret. Where did you meet her? At the bookstore. I was looking for a gift for Mrs. Henderson's birthday, and Lena helped me pick out something perfect. We started talking about books, and then, he shrugged, we kept talking. Margaret could picture it. Evan loved books almost as much as he loved quiet conversations with people who understood them. And if this Lena was someone who could help him find the perfect gift, someone who noticed the kinds of details he wrote about in his letters, then of course he would have been drawn to her. "Why didn't you bring her to dinner?" she asked. Evan met her eyes. "Would you have been comfortable?" The honesty of the question hit Margaret like cold water. Would she have been comfortable? Would she have spent the whole meal wondering what the neighbors would think, what their friends would say, whether this was just a phase or something more serious? Would she have seen Lena as a person Evan loved or as a problem that needed to be managed? "I would have tried to be," she said, but her voice sounded weak even to herself. Evan nodded slowly. "I know you would have tried. But I didn't want her to have to sit at this table while you tried. She deserves better than that." Charles had been quiet through this exchange, but now he spoke. "Where does this relationship stand?" "What do you mean? Are you serious about her? Is this—" Charles seemed to struggle for words. "Is this something permanent you're considering?" Evan looked down at the letters, then back up at his parents. "I want to marry her." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through the careful composure Margaret had been trying to maintain. "You want to marry her?" Charles repeated slowly. "Yes." "And you've been planning this for 8 months without saying a word to us." "I've been trying to figure out how to say it in a way that wouldn't create a crisis." Margaret felt something twist in her chest. "Do we really seem so unreasonable to you?" Evan's expression softened. "Not unreasonable, but you care about what people think. You always have. And I know that dating someone like Lena would raise questions in certain circles." "Someone like Lena," Charles said, and there was an edge in his voice that Margaret recognized. "What exactly does that mean?" "Someone who doesn't come from our world, someone whose grandmother worked as a housekeeper her whole life, someone who goes to night school and counts every penny." Evan's voice was steady, but Margaret could hear the pain underneath. "Someone who would feel out of place at the country club and wouldn't understand why that matters to people." "And you think that matters to us?" Margaret asked. Evan looked at her for a long moment. "I think it matters to the version of yourselves that you show to other people. And I think you care about that version more than you realize." It was such a gentle accusation, delivered with such sadness instead of anger, that Margaret felt her throat close up, because part of her knew he was right. She thought about the conversations she'd had with friends about their children's marriages, the careful way they described in-laws and backgrounds and social connections. She thought about the assumptions she had made about what kind of woman would be right for Evan, and how many of those assumptions had nothing to do with his happiness. Charles pushed his chair back from the table. "I need to think about this." "Think about what?" Evan asked. "Whether you can accept the woman I love? Think about what this means for our family." The words hung in the air like a judgment that hadn't been fully pronounced yet. Evan stood up slowly. "I should go." "Evan," Margaret said, reaching toward him, "we don't have to." "I should call her," he said quietly. "I should tell her that you know." He gathered the letters, placing them carefully back in the box. His movements were deliberate and gentle, like someone handling something precious that had already been damaged. "Are you going to bring her here?" Charles asked. "So we can meet her?" Evan paused with the box in his hands. "I don't know. I need to talk to her first. I need to figure out how to explain that I kept her a secret for 8 months because I was afraid of this conversation." He kissed Margaret's cheek, the same polite goodbye he had given her thousands of times before. But tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like the end of something. After he left, Margaret and Charles sat in the dining room with their half-eaten dinner growing cold between them. The empty space where the wooden box had been seemed to dominate the table. "Well," Charles said finally, "this is unexpected." Margaret nodded, though unexpected felt like too small a word for what had just happened. It was like finding out that the child you thought you knew had been living a completely different life, one where your love came with conditions you didn't even know you had set. "What do we do now?" she asked. Charles poured himself another glass of wine. "I suppose we wait to meet her. And if we don't like her, then we figure out whether that's because she's not right for our son or because we're not as open-minded as we thought we were." Margaret looked out the window at the darkening sky. Somewhere in this town, Evan was probably calling the woman he loved, trying to explain why he had never brought her home for dinner, trying to explain that he had a family who loved him but had never had to love anyone who didn't fit into their careful, comfortable world. She wondered what kind of woman could inspire letters like the ones she had read. What kind of woman could be patient enough to love someone in secret, strong enough to deserve the devotion Evan had written about? Most of all, she wondered if she and Charles would be able to see that woman clearly when they finally met her, or if they would only see all the ways she didn't match the picture they had painted of their son's future. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, and Margaret realized that everything she thought she knew about her family had changed in the space of a single dinner. Tomorrow, she would have to decide what kind of mother she wanted to be. Evan drove through the quiet streets of their coastal town with the wooden box sitting on the passenger seat beside him. The familiar route to Lena's apartment felt different tonight, weighted with the knowledge that his carefully maintained secret had crumbled in the space of a single dinner conversation. He parked outside the small building where she lived above the flower shop and sat for a moment, gathering his courage. Through her window, he could see the warm glow of the reading lamp she kept by her favorite chair. She would be there with a book, probably still wearing the soft sweater she'd put on that morning when he'd kissed her goodbye. The thought of that kiss, casual and comfortable in the way of people who had been kissing each other good morning for months, made his chest tight. How was he going to explain that he had been protecting something that maybe didn't want to be protected? He climbed the narrow stairs to her door and knocked softly, the way he always did. "It's open," Lena called from inside. He found her exactly where he had pictured her, curled in the oversized chair by the window with a paperback novel in her hands. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she was wearing the gray sweater that made her skin look like it was lit from within. She looked up when he entered, and her smile faltered when she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting down her book immediately. Evan held up the wooden box. "My mother found this." Lena stared at the box for a long moment, her face going very still. She had always been good at reading situations quickly, at understanding the implications of things without needing them spelled out. "Found it where?" "In my old bedroom." She was cleaning out some things. Evan sat down on the edge of the couch, suddenly feeling exhausted. She read some of the letters. "How many is some?" "I don't know. Enough to ask who you were." Lena stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. She was quiet for so long that Evan started to worry about what she might be thinking. "What did you tell them?" she asked finally. "The truth, that your name is Lena Brooks, that you work at the bookstore, and that I love you." She turned to face him. "Did you tell them I'm black?" "Yes." "How did they react?" Evan rubbed his face with his hands. "They were surprised. My father asked a lot of questions about what your plans are, where the relationship is going. My mother seemed, I don't know, shocked, I think." Lena nodded slowly, as if this was about what she had expected. "And now they want to meet me." "I think so, maybe. I left before we could get that far." She walked back to her chair, but didn't sit down. Instead, she stood behind it, her hands resting on the back like it was a shield. "Evan," she said, her voice gentler than he deserved, "why didn't you ever tell them about me?" It was the question he had been dreading, the one he had been asking himself for months. Because the real answer was worse than simple fear. It was the admission that part of him had always known this moment would come, and part of him had hoped it wouldn't have to. "Because I knew it would be complicated." Complicated for who? The question hung between them like a test he wasn't sure how to pass. "For everyone," he said finally. "For them, because they've never had to think about things like this before. For you, because you'd have to deal with their adjustment period. For me, because I'd have to watch both sides of my family try to figure out how to love each other." Lena sat down heavily. "Both sides of your family." "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it?" Her voice was still gentle, but there was something underneath it now that made Evan's stomach clench. "Evan, I've been patient with this. I've been understanding about why you wanted to take things slow, why you never wanted to go to places where we might run into people you knew. I told myself it was because you were being careful, because you wanted to make sure we were solid before you brought other people into it." She looked down at her hands. "But it wasn't that, was it?" "Lena, You were protecting them from me. You were protecting their comfort, their social circle, their version of how they wanted their lives to look. She met his eyes. You weren't protecting us. You were protecting them. The accuracy of her words hit him like a physical blow, because she was right, and they both knew it. I didn't want them to hurt you, he said weakly, by treating me like I didn't belong, by not understanding how incredible you are right away, by asking the wrong questions or making assumptions. Evan leaned forward, trying to find words that would explain 8 months of cowardice without sounding like excuses. You've never had to sit through dinner with people who think they're being open-minded by asking where you went to school and whether your family is from here. You've never had to smile while someone tells you how articulate you are, like it's a surprise. Lena's expression softened slightly. Have you? No, but I've watched it happen to other people, and I couldn't stand the thought of watching it happen to you. She was quiet for a long time, processing this. Outside, they could hear the sound of cars passing, people heading home from dinner or evening plans, living lives that felt simple and uncomplicated. So what happens now? She asked. I don't know. I suppose they'll want to meet you? And do you want them to meet me? It should have been an easy question. Of course he wanted the people he loved to know each other. Of course he wanted his parents to see what he saw in Lena, to understand why he had fallen in love with her mind and her laugh and the way she paid attention to the world around her. But the hesitation in his voice was answer enough. I want them to love you the way I do, he said, but I'm scared they won't know how. Lena nodded, and in her nod he could see her making some kind of decision. Evan, I need you to understand something. I've been in love before, with someone who was ashamed to be seen with me, not because of race, just because I wasn't what he thought he wanted people to know about him, and I promised myself I would never do that again. I'm not ashamed of you. Then why does this feel like you are? The question was so quiet, so sad, that Evan felt something break apart inside his chest. Because how could he explain that it wasn't shame, but fear? Fear that love wouldn't be enough to bridge the gap between the life he had always known and the life he wanted to build with her. I love you, he said, which was true but not an answer. I know you do, but love that hides isn't the same as love that chooses. She stood up again, and this time when she looked at him, he could see something shifting in her expression. I can't be your secret anymore, Evan. If you want this relationship to continue, it has to exist in the real world, with real people who know about it. What are you saying? I'm saying I won't go to family dinners where I have to prove I'm worthy of being there. I won't make small talk with people who are trying to figure out if I'm good enough for their son. And I won't pretend to be grateful for being included in a life you've been hiding me from for 8 months. Evan felt panic rise in his throat. So what do you want me to do? I want you to decide if you love me enough to choose me, not secretly, not carefully, not in a way that protects everyone else's comfort. Just choose me. She moved toward the kitchen, and he understood that this was his cue to leave, to go home and think about what she had said. But he couldn't move. The thought of walking out that door and driving home to his empty apartment, knowing that she was here questioning everything they had built together, felt impossible. What if I can't? He asked. The question came out smaller than he meant it to, like something a child might ask when faced with a task that felt too big. Lena stopped in the kitchen doorway and turned back to him. For a moment, her expression was so tender that he thought she might take it all back, might tell him they could figure it out together, slowly and carefully. Instead, she said, "Then you should let me go." The next morning, Lena opened Books and More with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had learned to work through heartbreak. She unlocked the door, flipped the sign to open, and began the familiar routine of checking the register and straightening shelves that didn't really need straightening. The bookstore was her sanctuary, the place where she felt most herself. She had been working here for 3 years, ever since she graduated with her bachelor's degree, and decided to stay in town to help take care of her grandmother. What had started as a temporary job had become something she genuinely loved, helping people find exactly the right book, ordering special titles for regular customers, creating displays that drew people towards stories they might not have discovered otherwise. This morning, though, the usual comfort of the place felt thin. She was rearranging the new fiction display when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up, half hoping and half dreading that it might be Evan, coming to tell her he had figured out how to be brave. Instead, she saw Mrs. Patterson, one of her regular customers, browsing the mystery section with the focused intensity of someone on a mission. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson," Lena called. "Looking for anything specific today?" "Oh, hello, dear. I finished that Louise Penny book you recommended, and I need something new for my book club. Do you have anything with a strong female detective? Nothing too violent. You know how squeamish some of the ladies get." Lena smiled, grateful for the distraction of work. She walked over to the mystery section and pulled out 3 options, explaining the merits of each while Mrs. Patterson listened with the serious attention she gave to all book recommendations. It was while she was describing the second book that she noticed the woman standing by the front window, looking uncertain about whether to come in. The woman was older, probably in her early 60s, well-dressed in the casual but expensive way of people who didn't have to think about money. Her silver hair was styled in a way that looked effortless, but probably wasn't, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of being comfortable in most situations. But right now, she looked nervous. After Mrs. Patterson left with her new mystery novel, the woman approached the counter. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the slight formality of someone who wasn't sure of the appropriate tone. "Are you Lena Brooks?" Lena's heart stopped. She had never seen this woman before, but something about her bearing, her carefully neutral expression, made her identity immediately clear. "Yes," Lena said. "I'm Lena. I'm Margaret Whitmore, Evan's mother." They looked at each other across the counter, 2 women who had been important to the same man for months without ever meeting. Lena found herself taking inventory of Margaret's appearance, looking for traces of Evan in her face, trying to read her intentions in her posture. "Would you mind if I looked around?" Margaret asked. "I've never been in here before." "Of course." Lena watched as Margaret moved slowly through the store, taking in the carefully organized sections, the comfortable reading chairs, the small cafe area where customers could sit with coffee and sample books before buying them. It was clear that she was seeing more than just the inventory. She was trying to understand what kind of place would attract her son, what kind of environment would feel like home to someone like him. Margaret stopped at the poetry section and pulled out a slim volume of Mary Oliver's work. "Evan always loved poetry," she said, almost to herself. "When he was young, he used to memorize poems and recite them at dinner. Charles thought it was impractical, but I loved listening to him." She opened the book and read silently for a moment. When she looked up, there was something different in her expression, something softer. "He wrote about you beautifully," Margaret said quietly. Lena felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He shouldn't have kept those letters where you could find them if he didn't want anyone to read them." "No, he shouldn't have." Margaret closed the poetry book and returned it to the shelf. "But I'm glad I did read them. They helped me understand some things about my son that I hadn't seen before." She moved to the front counter where Lena was standing, but she didn't seem to be in any hurry to say whatever she had come to say. "You have a beautiful store," Margaret said. "It feels welcoming, like a place people would want to spend time." "Thank you. Evan mentioned that you're working on your master's degree?" "In literature, yes. I'm writing my thesis on how independent bookstores serve as community spaces, particularly in small towns." Lena wasn't sure why she was offering this information, but something about Margaret's genuine curiosity made her want to answer honestly. "That sounds fascinating and challenging." "It is, but I love it. I love thinking about why people are drawn to stories, how books help us understand ourselves and each other." Margaret nodded, and for a moment they stood in comfortable silence, surrounded by thousands of stories written by people trying to make sense of human connection. "Lena," Margaret said finally, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For being the reason my son felt he had to hide you." The directness of the statement caught Lena off guard. She had been prepared for polite small talk, maybe some careful questions about her background or intentions. She hadn't been prepared for this kind of honesty. "You don't know me well enough to apologize to me," Lena said carefully. "I know myself well enough to know that if Evan was afraid to tell us about you, it's because we created an environment where that fear made sense." Margaret looked around the bookstore again, as if she was seeing it differently now. I spent 40 years building a life that felt safe and predictable. Good schools, nice friends, the right neighborhoods. I told myself I was creating stability for my family, but I think what I was really creating was a bubble. And bubbles are fragile things. They can't expand to include anything new without risking everything that's already inside. She met Lena's eyes. I don't want my son to have to choose between loving you and loving us, but I'm afraid that's exactly the position we've put him in. Lena felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of a knot she hadn't realized was there. Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to understand something. I don't want to take Evan away from your family. I just want to be acknowledged as part of his life. I know that now. The question is whether I can make Charles understand it, and whether Evan believes we can change. They were quiet again, both of them processing the weight of the conversation they were having. What was he like as a child? Lena asked suddenly. Margaret's face brightened in a way that made her look 10 years younger. Thoughtful. Always thoughtful. He was the kind of child who noticed when someone was sad, who remembered what you had told him about your day. He used to leave little notes for me when I was stressed about something. Just simple things like, "I hope you have a good day, Mom," written in his careful handwriting. He still does that, Lena said softly. Leaves notes. The letters. Not just letters, little things. Quotes he thinks I'll like written on bookmarks. Grocery lists with funny drawings in the margins. He notices everything. Margaret smiled, and for the first time since she had walked into the store, she looked completely relaxed. That's my boy. They talked for another few minutes about books in the town and the changes they had both seen over the years. It was easy conversation, the kind that happened between people who discovered they had more in common than they had expected. When Margaret finally left, she paused at the door. Lena, would you consider having dinner with us? Charles and I would like to meet you properly. Lena thought about what Evan had said the night before, about family dinners where she would have to prove she was worthy. But looking at Margaret now, seeing the genuine effort she was making to bridge a gap that had been created by years of assumptions, Lena felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. I'd like that, she said, but I think Evan should be the one to ask me. Margaret nodded. You're right, but I wanted you to know that the invitation is real, and that it comes from a place of wanting to know you, not wanting to judge you. After she left, Lena sat in the quiet bookstore and thought about courage, about the different kinds of bravery it took to love someone across difference, to expand your world to include people who might change it. She thought about Evan, probably sitting in his office right now, trying to figure out how to choose between the safety of the life he had always known and the uncertainty of the life they could build together. And she thought about Margaret, who had walked into a bookstore to meet a woman she had every reason to be suspicious of, and had instead tried to understand her. Maybe there was room for hope after all. But first, Evan would have to decide what he was willing to risk for. Evan spent the morning staring at spreadsheets without seeing the numbers. His office overlooked the harbor, and he kept finding himself watching the boats instead of working, thinking about the conversation he needed to have but didn't know how to start. His phone buzzed with a text from his cousin Daniel. Heard there was some excitement at dinner last night. Want to grab coffee? Daniel was 4 years older than Evan and had always been more like a brother than a cousin. He worked as a therapist in town and had a way of asking the right questions without making them feel like judgments. They met at the small cafe near the marina, the kind of place where locals gathered to talk about weather and fishing and who was dating whom. Daniel was already at a corner table when Evan arrived, nursing a coffee and reading the local paper. So, Daniel said without preamble, tell me about Lena. Evan sat down heavily. How do you know about Lena? Your mother called my mother at 6:30 this morning. Apparently she needed to process what happened at dinner. Daniel folded the paper and set it aside. She found love letters? A whole box of them. And you've been seeing this woman for 8 months without telling anyone. It wasn't a question, but Evan nodded anyway. Daniel was quiet for a moment, studying his cousin's face. What are you afraid of? Everything. The honesty of the answer surprised Evan. I'm afraid they'll never accept her. I'm afraid she'll get tired of waiting for them to try. I'm afraid I'm not brave enough to handle the fallout either way. What's she like? For the first time in 24 hours, Evan smiled. She's incredible. She reads 3 books a week and remembers everything about them. She knows all her regular customers' names and what kinds of stories they like. She takes care of her grandmother without complaining about how much it limits her social life. She makes me want to be better than I am. Sounds terrible, Daniel said dryly. I can see why your parents would object. It's not about her specifically. It's about what dating her means in their world. Daniel leaned forward. And what does it mean? Evan struggled to put into words the complex web of social expectations he'd grown up with. It means conversations at the country club. It means people asking questions that aren't really questions. It means my parents having to defend choices they didn't make to people whose approval they've always counted on. So you decided to protect them from that. I decided to protect everyone from it, including Lena. Daniel nodded slowly. How's that working out? The question hung between them like a challenge, because it wasn't working out at all. 8 months of secrecy had created exactly the kind of crisis Evan had been trying to avoid, only now it was worse because everyone involved felt betrayed. She told me last night that she won't be my secret anymore, Evan said quietly. That if I want the relationship to continue, it has to exist in the real world. What did you say? Nothing. I didn't know what to say. Daniel was quiet for a long time, sipping his coffee and watching the boats in the harbor. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. Evan, you know I love you like a brother. And because I love you, I'm going to tell you something you probably don't want to hear. Evan braced himself. You've been lying to everyone for 8 months. To your parents about having someone important in your life, to Lena about why you're keeping her hidden, and to yourself about what you're actually protecting. What do you mean? I mean you're not protecting them from social awkwardness. You're protecting yourself from having to take a stand. The words hit Evan like a slap, partly because they stung and partly because they felt true. You think I'm a coward. I think you're human. But I also think you're at a crossroads where being human isn't enough anymore. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Tell me something. When you imagine your life 5 years from now, what does it look like? Evan closed his eyes and let himself picture it. Lena and I are married. We have a house near the water, maybe a dog. She's finished her master's degree and is thinking about opening her own bookstore. We have people over for dinner on weekends, friends who love books and good conversation. Are your parents in that picture? I hope so. But not if it means Lena has to spend every family gathering proving she belongs there. Daniel nodded. So what are you going to do about it? It was the question Evan had been avoiding since the moment his mother had placed that wooden box on the dinner table, because the answer required him to do the one thing he had spent 8 months trying not to do, choose a side. I don't know, he said, but even as he said it, he realized that wasn't true. He did know. He had known since the moment Lena had told him she wouldn't be his secret anymore. He just wasn't sure he was brave enough to do what needed to be done. That afternoon, Evan drove to the small house where Lena lived with her grandmother. Ruth Daniels was 70 years old and had raised Lena since she was 12 after her parents died in a car accident. Evan had met Ruth only a handful of times, but he had liked her immediately. She had the same sharp intelligence as her granddaughter, combined with the directness that came from 7 decades of not having time for nonsense. Ruth answered the door wearing gardening gloves and a patient expression. Evan, she said, Lena's at work. I know, I was hoping to talk to you. Ruth studied his face for a moment, then stepped aside to let him in. I was just making tea. You want some? The house was small but immaculate, filled with books and photographs and the kind of comfortable furniture that invited long conversations. Ruth led him to the kitchen, where she poured 2 cups of tea and sat down at the wooden table that looked like it had hosted 1,000 important discussions. So, she said, settling into her chair, I'm guessing this is about whatever has my granddaughter looking like she didn't sleep last night. Evan wrapped his hands around the warm teacup, grateful for something to hold on to. Did she tell you what happened? She told me your family found out about her, and that she decided she's tired of being kept like a secret. The way Ruth said it, without judgment but with perfect clarity, made Evan realize how the situation must look to someone outside it. I wasn't trying to keep her as a secret, he said. I was trying to protect her. From what? From having to deal with my family's adjustment period. Ruth sipped her tea and waited for him to continue. She had the therapist's gift of comfortable silence, of letting people talk themselves toward understanding. My parents are good people, Evan said finally, but they live in a world where certain things are expected, where everyone looks the same and comes from the same background. I didn't know how to bring Lena into that world without subjecting her to questions and comments that would make her feel like she had to prove herself. So you decided not to bring her into it at all. I thought I was being considerate. Ruth set down her teacup and looked at him with the kind of expression that suggested she was about to share some hard-won wisdom. Evan, I've been black in this country for 70 years. I've been the only black woman in more rooms than I can count. I've smiled through conversations where people talked about me like I wasn't there, and I've proven myself to people who should have taken my worth for granted. She leaned forward slightly. And you know what I learned from all that? Evan shook his head. I learned that being protected from other people's ignorance doesn't help anyone grow. Your family's never going to learn how to love my granddaughter if they never get the chance to try. And Lena is never going to know if they're worth her effort if you don't give her the opportunity to find out. What if they hurt her? What if they don't? The simplicity of the question caught Evan off guard. He had spent so much time imagining worst-case scenarios that he hadn't considered the possibility that his family might surprise him. Besides, Ruth continued, my granddaughter is stronger than you think. She doesn't need you to protect her from difficult conversations. She needs you to stand beside her during them. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sound of wind chimes on the back porch and the distant noise of children playing in the street. Ruth, Evan said finally, what would you do if you were me? I'd stop trying to manage other people's feelings and start being honest about my own. She stood up to refill her teacup. And I'd remember that. Love isn't something you hide to keep it safe. It's something you choose, publicly and repeatedly, especially when that choice is difficult. When Evan left Ruth's house, he drove slowly through town, taking the long way back to his office. He passed the bookstore where Lena was working, probably helping customers find exactly the right story for their needs. He passed the country club where his parents were members, where conversations happened in careful code about who belonged and who didn't. And he passed the small church where his grandmother had taken him as a child, where he had learned that love was supposed to be the thing you chose when everything else felt uncertain. By the time he got back to his office, Evan knew what he needed to do. He just hoped it wasn't too late. Lena was closing the bookstore when Evan appeared at the front door. She had been expecting him all day, but seeing him standing there with his hands in his pockets and uncertainty written across his face still made her chest tighten. She unlocked the door to let him in, then locked it behind him. The store felt different with just the two of them in it, more intimate and more fragile. How are you? He asked. Tired, she said honestly. Confused. Your mother came by this morning. Evan's eyebrows shot up. She what? She came to the store. We talked. Lena moved to the counter and began processing the day's sales, partly because it needed to be done, and partly because she needed something to do with her hands. She apologized. For what? For being the reason you felt you had to hide me. Evan was quiet, processing this. What did you say? I told her I don't want to take you away from your family. I just want to be acknowledged as part of your life. She finished counting the register and looked up at him. Evan, I need to know where we stand. He took a deep breath, the kind that suggested he was about to say something that scared him. I went to see your grandmother this afternoon. Why? Because I needed to understand something. He moved closer to the counter, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his jaw was set with determination. Ruth helped me realize that I've been trying to solve the wrong problem. What do you mean? I've been trying to figure out how to protect you from my family's reaction instead of trying to figure out how to help them understand why you're worth changing for. Lena felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of disappointment she'd been carrying since their conversation the night before. And what conclusion did you come to? Evan reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. Lena's breath caught. I've been carrying this around for 2 months, he said, his voice steadier than she had expected. I kept waiting for the right moment, the perfect time when everything would be simple and easy. He opened the box to reveal a simple solitaire ring, elegant in its understated beauty. But Ruth helped me understand that there's no such thing as the perfect moment. There's just the moment when you stop being afraid and start being brave. Lena stared at the ring, then at Evan's face. What are you saying? I'm saying I love you, and I want to marry you, and I don't want to wait for my family's permission to build a life with you. He dropped to one knee behind the counter, looking up at her with an expression that was equal parts terror and hope. Lena Brooks, will you marry me? For a moment, the bookstore was completely silent, except for the sound of their breathing and the distant noise of traffic outside. Even if your parents don't approve, she asked quietly, especially if my parents don't approve, because that's when choosing you means the most. Lena looked down at him, this man who had written her love letters for 8 months, but had been too afraid to introduce her to his family. But she also saw the man who had just knelt down in a bookstore and offered to choose her over the comfort and safety of everything he had ever known. Yes, she said, and the word came out like a breath she had been holding for months. Evan slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook slightly, then stood up and kissed her with the kind of kiss that felt like a promise and a beginning. When they broke apart, Lena looked down at the ring sparkling on her finger. It fit perfectly, which meant he had been planning this longer than 2 months, which meant he had been thinking about forever, even while he was still afraid to introduce her to his parents. What happens now? She asked. Now I call my parents and tell them I'm bringing my fiancé to dinner this weekend. And if they say no? Evan smiled, and for the first time in days, it reached his eyes. Then we have dinner somewhere else, and we keep having dinner somewhere else until they decide they miss me enough to try. Lena laughed, the sound echoing off the walls of the bookstore like music. You know this isn't going to be easy. I know, but you're worth whatever it takes. They stood in the quiet bookstore, surrounded by thousands of love stories written by people who had figured out that sometimes the most important choice you can make is to choose love over comfort, hope over fear, and truth over the safety of keeping secrets. Outside, the sun was setting over the harbor, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and inside, 2 people who had loved each other in secret for 8 months finally began planning a life they could live in the light. The call to his parents was shorter than Evan had expected. He stood in his apartment that evening, looking out at the harbor while his mother's voice carried across the distance between them. You're engaged, Margaret repeated, her tone carefully neutral. Yes, I proposed this afternoon. And you'd like to bring her to dinner? This Saturday, if that works for you and Dad? There was a pause, and Evan could hear muffled conversation in the background, his mother covering the phone to speak with his father. We'll see you both at 7, Margaret said finally. Is there anything special we should prepare? The question was loaded with uncertainty, with the kind of careful consideration that came from people trying not to make assumptions about someone they had never met. Just dinner, Evan said. Lena's not complicated. She just wants to meet you. After he hung up, Evan sat on his couch and thought about the conversation he would need to have with Lena. Because while he felt more certain than he ever had about his choice to marry her, he also knew that Saturday's dinner would be a test for all of them. Lena spent Friday evening with her grandmother, sitting at the same kitchen table where Evan had asked for advice 24 hours earlier. You nervous? Ruth asked, watching her granddaughter turn the engagement ring around and around on her finger. Terrified, Lena admitted. What if they hate me? Then they hate you. But you'll know where you stand, and you can make decisions from there. Ruth's pragmatism was both comforting and unnerving. Lena had always admired her grandmother's ability to face difficult situations with clear eyes, but tonight she would have preferred some gentle reassurance that everything would work out fine. What if I say the wrong thing? What's the wrong thing? I don't know. Something that makes them think Evan is making a mistake. Ruth reached across the table and covered Lena's hand with her own. Baby girl, you've been worried about being good enough for other people your whole life. But you know what I learned watching you grow up? Lena shook her head. I learned that the people worth knowing will see your goodness without you having to prove it, and the people who need convincing probably aren't worth the effort. She squeezed Lena's hand gently. You go to that dinner tomorrow and you be yourself. If that's not enough for them, then they're not enough for you. Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made the coastal town look like a postcard. Lena chose her outfit carefully, a navy dress that was elegant without being formal, with a cardigan that had been her mother's. She wanted to look respectful, but not like she was trying too hard. Evan picked her up at 6:30, and they drove through the quiet streets toward his parents' house. The Whitmore family home was in the oldest part of town, where large houses sat on generous lots behind stone walls and mature trees. It was beautiful in the way that old money often was, understated but unmistakably substantial. "It's lovely," Lena said as they pulled into the circular driveway. "It's intimidating," Evan replied. "I should have warned you about that." "I've been intimidated before. I'll survive." Margaret answered the doctor herself, wearing a soft gray sweater and pearls that looked like they had been passed down through generations. She smiled when she saw them, and Lena was relieved to see that the smile reached her eyes. "Lena," Margaret said, extending her hand, "I'm so glad you could come." "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Whitmore. Please, call me Margaret." Charles appeared in the foyer behind his wife, tall and distinguished in the way of men who had spent their careers in boardrooms. His handshake was firm, his smile polite but reserved. "Welcome to our home," he said. The house was exactly what Lena had expected, tastefully decorated with antiques and oil paintings, books that looked like they had been carefully selected for their leather bindings rather than their contents. But there were also personal touches that made it feel like a home rather than a museum. Photographs of Evan at various ages, a reading chair by the window that was clearly someone's favorite spot, fresh flowers from what must be Margaret's garden. They gathered in the living room for drinks before dinner. Lena accepted a glass of wine and sat on the edge of the sofa, hyper-aware of every word she spoke. "Evan tells us you're working on your master's degree," Charles said. "What's your area of study?" "Literature. I'm writing my thesis on independent bookstores as community spaces." "That sounds fascinating. What drew you to that topic?" Lena relaxed slightly as she explained her research, describing how bookstores served as informal meeting places where people could discover not just new books, but new ideas and connections. Charles asked thoughtful questions, and she found herself forgetting to be nervous as they discussed the changing landscape of retail and community engagement. Margaret mostly listened, but Lena caught her watching the way Evan looked at her when she spoke, the small smile that crossed his face when she made a point he was particularly proud of. When they moved to the dining room, Lena was struck by the formality of the table setting. Multiple forks, crystal glasses, cloth napkins that had been pressed into perfect squares. It was the kind of dinner table she had seen in movies but never actually sat at. The conversation during dinner was careful but not uncomfortable. They talked about books, about the town's upcoming festival, about Evan's work. Margaret asked about Lena's grandmother, and Lena found herself telling stories about Ruth's garden and her volunteer work at the library. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Margaret said. "She is. She raised me after my parents died, and she never once made it feel like a burden. She taught me that family is about choice as much as blood." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Lena realized she had inadvertently made a point about acceptance and belonging that applied to more than just her relationship with her grandmother. Charles set down his wine glass. "Lena, I hope you don't mind a direct question." "Not at all. What are your intentions with our son?" The question was so formal, so old-fashioned, that Lena almost smiled, but she could see that Charles was serious, that this was his way of trying to understand what kind of person she was and what kind of future she envisioned. "I intend to love him for as long as he'll let me," she said simply. "I intend to support his dreams and share my own with him. I intend to build a life with him that's based on honesty and respect and the kind of partnership where we both become better people." She looked from Charles to Margaret, then at Evan, who was watching her with an expression of such love and pride that she felt her confidence strengthen. "I know this probably isn't what you pictured for your son," she continued. "I know I don't come from the same world you do, that my family doesn't have the same history or connections. But I love Evan deeply, and I believe he loves me the same way. And I think that should be what matters most." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It felt more like the pause that comes when people are processing something important. Finally, Margaret spoke. When I was your age, I thought love was about finding someone who fit into your existing life perfectly. Someone who shared your background and your assumptions and your plans. She looked at her husband, then at her son. It took me 40 years to understand that the best kind of love is the kind that expands your life, that challenges you to become more than you thought you could be. She turned to Lena. I read some of Evan's letters to you. I hope you don't mind. I was trying to understand what I had missed, why my son felt he couldn't share something so important with us. Lena glanced at Evan, who nodded encouragingly. Those letters showed me a side of Evan I had never seen before. Not just the romantic side, though, that was lovely, but the side of him that pays attention to small details, that finds poetry in everyday moments, that thinks deeply about what it means to love someone well. Margaret's voice grew softer. I realized that you haven't just captured my son's heart. You've helped him discover parts of himself that I don't think he even knew existed. She reached across the table and touched Lena's hand. So thank you for that. And thank you for being patient with a family that needed time to catch up to what our son already knew. Charles cleared his throat. I owe you an apology as well, Lena. And Evan, I owe you an apology too. He looked uncomfortable with the emotional turn the conversation had taken, but determined to see it through. I've spent my whole life believing that the best way to protect the people I love is to maintain certain standards, certain expectations. But I see now that those standards were really about my own comfort, not about what would actually make my family happy. He met Lena's eyes. You clearly make my son happy in ways I didn't even know to hope for. And if you're willing to overlook the fact that it took us this long to figure that out, we'd be honored to welcome you into our family. Lena felt tears prick at her eyes. The acceptance was more generous than she had dared to hope for, offered with the kind of humility that suggested it was genuine. I'd like that very much, she said. Evan reached for her hand under the table, and she could feel some of the tension he had been carrying for months finally release. The rest of dinner passed in a different atmosphere, warmer and more relaxed. Margaret told embarrassing stories about Evan's childhood, and Charles asked detailed questions about Lena's thesis that showed he was actually interested in her work. Evan sat back and watched his two worlds finally come together, looking like a man who had been holding his breath for 8 months and could finally exhale. When coffee was served, Margaret disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a small wrapped box. This belonged to Evan's great-grandmother, she said, setting the box in front of Lena. She was a woman who believed in following her heart, even when it led her places other people didn't understand. Inside the box was a delicate gold bracelet, simple but beautiful, with a small charm in the shape of an open book. The book was added later, Margaret explained. When we heard about your work at the bookstore, it seemed like the right touch. Lena looked up, confused. When did you hear about my work? Margaret smiled, looking slightly embarrassed. I may have visited your store yesterday to do a little reconnaissance. I wanted to see what kind of environment my son had fallen in love with. And I bought 3 books and made an appointment to come back for your book club next week. Lena laughed, the sound bright and surprised. You want to join our book club? I want to be part of the things that are important to you, Margaret said simply. Both of you. As they prepared to leave, Charles shook Evan's hand and then, unexpectedly, pulled him into a brief hug. I'm proud of you, he said quietly. Not for the choice you made, but for the courage it took to make it. Margaret walked them to the door, and as they stood in the foyer saying goodbyes, she pulled Lena aside. There's something I want you to know, she said quietly. When I read those letters, what struck me most wasn't just how much Evan loves you. It was how much he respects you, the way he writes about your thoughts, your opinions, your dreams. It's clear that he sees you as his equal in every way that matters. She paused, looking thoughtful. I've known my son for 29 years, and I've never seen him write about anyone with that kind of reverence. You've given him something I couldn't, the experience of loving someone who challenges him to be his best self. Lena felt overwhelmed by the generosity of the statement. Thank you for saying that. Thank you for being the kind of person it's true about. On the drive home, Lena and Evan were quiet at first, both of them processing what had just happened. That went better than I expected, Lena said finally. That went better than I dared to hope, Evan replied. My mother wants to join your book club. I heard that. What do you think we should have her read first? Something that will challenge her assumptions about the world, Lena laughed. I think tonight already did that. They drove through the quiet streets of their town, past the bookstore where they had met, past the harbor where they had taken so many evening walks, past all the familiar places that would now hold different memories. Evan, Lena said as they pulled up to her building, what made you decide to propose when you did? What changed? He turned off the engine and sat for a moment, thinking about her question. I think I finally understood the difference between love that protects and love that chooses, he said. For 8 months, I was trying to protect you from my family's potential reaction, and I was trying to protect them from having to confront their own limitations. But what I was really doing was protecting myself from having to take a stand. He looked at her, his expression serious. When you told me you wouldn't be my secret anymore, you were really telling me that protection without commitment isn't love. It's just fear with good intentions. Lena reached for his hand. And now? Now I choose you. Publicly, permanently, and without reservation. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed the spot where her engagement ring caught the streetlight. Now I choose the life we can build together over the comfort of the life I've always known. They sat in the car for a few more minutes, talking about the dinner and the ring and the wedding they would start planning. But mostly they just sat together, two people who had finally figured out that the best kind of love wasn't the kind that hid in secret letters, but the kind that announced itself to the world with quiet confidence. When Lena finally went upstairs, she found Ruth waiting up for her in the kitchen, reading a novel and drinking tea. How did it go? Ruth asked. Better than I thought possible. Lena sat down at the table and told her grandmother about the dinner, about Margaret's visit to the bookstore, about the bracelet that now circled her wrist alongside her engagement ring. Sounds like they're good people who got trapped by their own assumptions, Ruth said when Lena finished. That happens to the best of us. What do you think happens next? Ruth closed her book and looked at her granddaughter with the kind of love that had sustained Lena through every difficult moment of her life. I think you marry that boy, and you build a beautiful life together. I think his parents become family to you, real family, the kind that chooses to love you every day. And I think you all learn that love is bigger and stronger than any of the things people worry will tear it apart. She stood up and kissed the top of Lena's head. Now go to bed, baby girl. You've got a wedding to plan. 3 months later, Lena and Evan were married in the small church where Evan had learned his first lessons about love and faith. The ceremony was simple but beautiful, attended by both families and the friends who had been waiting for this love story to finally step into the light. Margaret and Ruth sat together in the front row, having discovered a friendship built on their shared devotion to the young couple and their mutual appreciation for direct conversation and strong tea. Charles walked Margaret down the aisle and shook Evan's hand with the kind of pride that suggested he had finally learned the difference between the son he had expected and the son he actually had. The reception was held at the bookstore, transformed for the evening with lights and flowers and tables full of people who loved books and good conversation. Margaret had indeed joined the book club, where she had quickly become known for her thoughtful questions and her willingness to admit when a story changed her perspective. During the dancing, Evan and Lena found themselves in the poetry section, stealing a quiet moment away from their guests. No regrets? Evan asked, spinning her slowly between the shelves. Only one, Lena said, smiling up at him. What's that? I regret that it took us 8 months to get here. I wish I'd been brave enough to push for this sooner. Evan stopped dancing and cupped her face in his hands. We got here exactly when we were supposed to, and now we have the rest of our lives to practice being brave together. He kissed her then, surrounded by thousands of love stories written by people who had figured out what they were just learning, that the best kind of love is the kind that chooses courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and hope over fear. Outside, the harbor sparkled in the moonlight, and inside, 2 families who had learned to expand their definitions of belonging celebrated the beginning of a love story that would be written not in secret letters, but in the daily choices of a life shared openly and without reservation. The wooden box that had started it all sat on the gift table, No longer a container for hidden secrets, but a reminder that love grows strongest when it finally has room to breathe. And in the margins of the guest book, people wrote wishes and blessings for a couple who had learned that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply choose to love someone completely, publicly, and without apology. The end.